Of the City Club of Portland. I'm Jim Westwood, your president. We have several new members seated at the new members table today, and I'd like to ask them to stand as I introduce them. First, Joy Cook, president of Alpha Graphics. Michael Minton, president of Oregon Biotechnology Association. Ava Reyes, personnel administrator for the Housing Authority of Portland. And I guess that's the three that we have here today who are new, and welcome all three of you to City Club. There are other new members who weren't able to attend. I want to thank the recruiters of all our new members. Those City Club members who recruited new members this week are Karen Crone, Beth Laprinzi, Margaret Mahoney, Dana Peck, and William Walker. Next Friday, August 23rd, Mark Lovelace, MD, the director of the HIV program at the Oregon Health Sciences University, will be at City Club speaking on HIV-positive doctors and the issue of disclosure in a talk titled Paranoia in the Medical Clinic, the Fear of HIV. That will be here at the Benson Hotel in the Mayfair Room next Friday, August 23rd. The following Friday, August 30th, Frank E. Bronner, Executive Vice President of the Oregon Bankers Association, with a very timely topic. He'll be speaking on crisis in the banking industry, perception or reality. Is BCCI an illusion? That was my own comment. That will also be here at the Benson Hotel, Mayfair Room. Several members of City Club have recently asked how one goes about getting one of the blue City Club lapel pins, which those of you in the radio audience can't see, but it's a striking lapel pin that I'm wearing, and I see several of them in the audience. They are available for purchase at the City Club office to anyone who is interested. The cost is $3. Please call or stop by the club office, purchase one, and wear it proudly. Membership renewals each week. City Club, of course, puts you on the front line of emerging and enduring issues if you're a member. Upcoming programs will feature such things as disclosure of HIV-infected medical caregivers, the issue of environmental rights in Oregon. 4 memorable programs are coming up celebrating City Club's 75th anniversary, and I'm sure you won't want to miss any of them. When you become a member, you receive advanced program information, invitations to special events, the right to serve on research and issue area committees. Some call that an onerous duty, but they love to do it. It's exhilarating, hard work. You also get access to all club research reports and much more. Membership in City Club does keep you in touch with the issues and the region's opinion makers, and as a member, you'll have the opportunity to meet some of the most interesting people in Portland, your fellow members of City Club. Remember, membership in City Club is open to all. And those of you who are seated in our audience today will find membership forms. I know there are several guests here today. Membership forms are in front of you on your tables. Those of you in our radio audience or anyone else wishing to join City Club, you just call the club office at 228-7231 for membership information. That's 228-7231. I think you can note, if you're in the audience here today, that our speaker seated at the head table is not Congressman Ron Wyden. Contrary to a mistaken TV program listing that showed him as today's speaker, Congressman Wyden will be speaking to City Club on October 25th. Our speaker today, I should mention first of all our board host, Gretchen Lashley, seated at the head table, our first vice president and member of the Board of Governors. She will ask the first question of our speaker. Second question will be asked from the floor by Dennis Cusack, former member of the Program Committee and the Science and High-Tech Standing Committee. After that, of course, we open up the meeting to questions from the floor from members. Written questions will be asked as time allows, and there are forms for written questions on your tables. Please hold those up at the end of our speaker's comments, and a staff member will pick those up and bring them up to the head table. Today's City Club speaker is Paul Dudley Hart, the executive director of the Pacific Crest Outward Bound School, an outdoor self-sufficiency and leadership training ground for people from teenage, and I was surprised to find also up to middle age. Mr. Hart came to Outward Bound, which is based in Portland but conducts classes from California to Washington, and I'm told soon in Mexico. He came here last year. Before that, he had spent 9 years in Massachusetts at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Going back from that, his curriculum vitae really gets interesting. Here we have a native Briton who basically ran away to Australia at the age of 17 and spent the next 14 years aboard and around ships that conducted underwater photography, research in the Antarctic, and other marine research. He also engaged in applied scientific engineering throughout Latin America. As Executive Director of Outward Bound, Paul Dudley Hart oversees a school that last year provided outdoor experiences to over 2,700 students and has a current annual budget of over $4 million. He's an articulate and popular spokesman for the Outward Bound experience. I imagine a lot of us are wondering what we can do to get a job like his. And here to tell us about Outward Bound and how it can affect not only its students but also society as well is its Executive Director, Paul Dudley Hart.
Well, I guess you could push me under a bus, but short of that, I guess I should first answer the question, why me and why Outward Bound? I am new to the field of education in a formal sense, and I'm new to the Northwest. So with some notable educators in the room, and as a newcomer to this part of the world, I approach this talk with some trepidation. Why me? I grew up in England, the end of World War II, in a time that was a little depressing. Our playgrounds were basically bomb sites, and we really weren't terribly deprived, but life was very gray. I grew up in a generation which collectively lost hope to some degree. We lost our sense of the possible. I also grew up in a rather rigid, rather desert-like education system that had not changed for many years and had not adapted to the present. And I also had something of a learning disability. I was a terrible student. But what I lacked in academics, I found that I could learn through some very peculiar vehicles. A 12-foot sailboat that I could make to do almost anything became the first handhold to my establishing my self-respect. After that, a few adventures in different ways and getting into trouble with my parents convinced me that I did have some capability, even if it was only resulting in getting my parents upset. But I was brought up to be a doctor, and I didn't want to be one. And in those days, if you were a young Englishman of less than 21 years old, you could go to Australia free, which was perceived to be a very empty place that could be filled with young Englishmen without any sort of real sense of direction. So at 17 years old, with $13 in my pocket, I got onto a plane to Sydney, absolutely terrified. It was a game of bluff and counter-bluff with my father. Neither of us ever suspected I'd get on the plane. What I learned, though, is that what I realized is that I learned through experience. I learned by engaging myself in something in a very tactile sense. I learned by impelling myself into an experience and then breaking it down to things that I could actually work on, I could immerse myself in, and then things fell into place. I was fortunate to join a sailing ship in Australia and spent about 3 years on her doing underwater filming all the way across the Pacific. And when that ship was lost in a hurricane in 1969, I managed to get down to Melbourne and was rather cold, and this large American ship came up the river, which was very gray and very rusty, and it was full of long-haired people who I later came to recognize as scientists. And I went aboard to try and buy a pea jacket, and to my great surprise, ended up being offered a job. So I went to sea and spent most of the next 10 years in the Antarctic. I spent about 72 months in the ice out of those 10 years. And that was where I really got thrown into some extraordinary learning. It was a community of 100 people. We would go through this regular catharsis from life. We'd sail down to the ice, and then this community of 100 people would, through various extremely defined and predictable steps, encounter some collective reality and go through a very intense learning experience. The interesting thing was the community aboard. 50% of the ship were crew members. Most of them were high school dropouts from Brooklyn and Oakland. Most of them from culturally diverse backgrounds, although a very wise woman who I've come to know recently, Kathleen Sadat, suggested that we change the word diverse and use the word inclusive, a suggestion that I've followed since. So it was a very culturally inclusive ship. 50% of them, as I said, from Brooklyn and Oakland, and the other 50% from the premier universities of the United States. Superbly qualified, superbly educated people. And it was then that I began to realize that we were a nation of experts, but we were not a nation that had spent enough time educating our populace in terms of leadership. We gave people enormous amounts of facts and some methods to cull through those facts, but we really had not given them a preparation in problem solving, decision making, and codependency on one another. What usually happened on these trips is that the most educated crumbled and the least educated flourished. And I don't necessarily include myself in that. But it was fascinating to see a mess boy from Brooklyn take a PhD from Columbia University under his wing and say, you know, this is how you can survive. This is how you can flourish. This is how you can function. It was probably one of the most rewarding experiences of my life as I went through this experience and ended up being responsible for its direction, to see this happen over and over again. It did make me very aware that there was some severe lacking in our education system. From there, I went on to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I became an administrator of what is, I think, rather incorrectly called global science, because it is usually global science, in my opinion anyway, is not necessarily inclusive of the concerns of the global community and the global society. There I sort of operated on the interface, on that porous membrane between science and society, and found that the lecture that C.P. Snow gave at Cambridge 40 years ago is more true than ever. The two cultures who do not communicate, who do not share a language, the cultures of humanities and the cultures of science, they're not integrated. And C.P. Snow, in his speech at Cambridge, focused on the bridge between the cultures. And I think that there's not a need for a bridge there. There's a need for an educational middle ground. And I think too often we talk in terms of bridges over voids rather than talk about filling the void. So anyway, that's how I came to be here. And all those thoughts that I had about this lacking of in some stage of education were probably most exactly articulated in recent months by Robert Fulghum in his famous book, Everything I Ever Wanted to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So anyway, this talk also helps focus my thoughts, because I've now been with Outward Bound a year. I'm still not absolutely sure if I'm on a second career or a sabbatical, but it's been probably one of the most intense learning experiences of my life. To leave all the comfort of science. If this was a scientific talk, I'd have all my wonderful slides lined up, and I'd have some great pictures of the Titanic sinking or of something being discovered, and I'd be able to distract you from the meat of the lecture and entertain you, whereas this is pure sort of unadulterated speaking, and I think that the humanities are somewhat more accountable in those terms. Another thing, incidentally, that did lead me to the decision to come over to the humanities side of the street was our discovery at Woods Hole of the Titanic, which ended up being a tremendous crisis of values. Do you loot the wreck and pay, double the endowment of your institution, or do you leave it there, as we did, and it was later looted by others? What was the effect of this celebrity on some of the extraordinarily talented scientists who were involved with the discovery? There was a tremendous, again, a sort of a spurt of learning for me around that. But on to Outward Bound. What I'd like to do in this talk, and as I've said, this talk is helping to focus my own thoughts, and it's been a good sort of discipline for me to do, is to give you a summary of its history, the history of Outward Bound, its defining philosophy, its role in tackling some of the problems that society is now facing, and then the methods that we use and the results that we get. And I'm going to try and do all of that in the next 25 minutes. Instead of slides, because I can't really throw away all my crutches, I'm going to use verbalizations or verbal slides, or what we call in Outward Bound readings. And the first one is this, so this is my first slide. Nothing in education is so astonishing as the amount of ignorance it accumulates in the form of inert facts. Henry Brooke Adams, 1918. Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe, H.G. Wells. Outward Bound's roots lie in Plato's thoughts. It's nothing radical and it's nothing new. It's just recently underutilized. The premise is that the purpose of education is to prepare young people for citizenship. And if you didn't prepare them when they're young, then prepare them whenever you can get them. Outward Bound was the brainchild of an extraordinary German Jew called Kurt Hahn. He was in the foreign ministry of Germany in World War I and was one of the principal advocates for the armistice. After the war, he decided to become an educator because he was so concerned with the values that he felt had led to World War I. And he started a school called Salem in Gordenston, Salem in Germany. And then, just after Kristallnacht, he was asked to leave Germany by Hitler, when he said that his alumni either had to renounce their membership in the Nazi Party or renounce their membership in the Alumni Association. He left the next day, formed a school in Scotland called Gordonston, and his most famous pupil at that time was Prince Philip, the Queen of England's husband, who still remains its patron. At the core of Hahn's educational philosophy was this wonderful statement: education must be an antidote for the misery of unimportance, to allow children an escape, a way out of the misery of unimportance. And I'd like to share with you what Hahn's report card looked like at Gordonston and Salem. So these were the categories that the housemasters would fill in. These were, in those days, boys' schools only. First category, public spirit. Second, sense of justice. Then, ability to follow out what he or she believed to be the right course in the face of various physical and psychological obstacles. Ability to state facts precisely. Ability to plan, to organize, both as shown in the doing of his or her work and in his or her direction of younger students. To deal with the unexpected. His or her conscientiousness, both in everyday affairs and in tasks with which he or she was especially entrusted. His imagination and manners, his or her, I'm adding the her since it was a boys' school. His or her manual dexterity, the quality of his handiwork and other practical work, and the quality of his work in music, drawing, and other artistic endeavors. Then came the report on academic performance, and only then. And the most important section, which was a sort of a matrix throughout all of those qualities, was sense of service. Hahn's philosophy had two objectives: to enable students to make intelligent judgments and to develop the inherent strengths of his or her selfhood, to produce young people able to effect what they see to be right, despite hardships, despite dangers, despite inner skepticism, despite boredom, mockery from the world, and the emotion of the moment. Hahn was very much concerned with the climate of inquiry. Every time he said, you teach something, you deny the student the opportunity of discovery. He said, stop teaching. Fire the teacher who talks for more than 30% of a class. He was quite an extraordinary man. So where in all of this is Outward Bound? That's the educational philosophy. Well, Hahn saw the educational community moving from this interactive model, or the beginnings of this interactive model that was actually proving to be stillborn at that time, towards a more information retentive model. I guess the best way that I can analogize that is the student just rushing down the corridor of the school to get to the examination room after days of pumping fact after fact after fact into him or her, getting into the exam room and then regurgitating this extraordinary amount of information onto the page and leaving with a huge sense of relief and never, ever using that information again. What a peculiar way to educate people. And I know I was one of those. Oh, it was awful. Hahn's brainchild was originally for other purposes. Outward Bound, he saw that he couldn't establish schools like Salem and Gordonston to educate the world. And he knew that the educational community was not willing to adopt that. So he decided that he had to establish an adaptive program. It had been, in fact, already created for other purposes. In World War II, when the convoys were going across the Atlantic to keep Britain supplied, vast amounts of shipping were lost, as I think you all know. What became apparent, though, is that when these merchant ships were lost, they could build new merchant ships, they couldn't replace the seamen. And the thing that was perplexing is that it wasn't the elderly, unfit seamen who were surviving, it was the young ones. The 18-year-olds, the 20-year-olds, the 25-year-olds were dying. The older ones were flourishing. Or not flourishing, but surviving. The reason was that the younger people had no idea of their own capability. They were not in touch with their own tenacity. They had never been put in touch with the inherent courage that exists and strength that exists within everybody. They were giving up. Things seemed overwhelming, so they just gave up and died. So he was asked to establish a school that would take apprentice seamen and put them through an intensive course of about 27 days to put them in touch with this courage, to test it. He did that with a fellow called Lawrence Holt, who was an extraordinarily, was a Renaissance man. He was an incredibly wise man of the time who owned a shipping line. And the survival rates quadrupled within 6 months. That's probably still one of the most compelling proofs of the sort of the outward bound pedagogy. But that was the origin of Outward Bound. After the war, it was used essentially as a program for apprentices. Factories would send their apprentices to Outward Bound to learn a set of values which perhaps they'd had a problem learning at home. Mostly very blue-collar, mostly very impoverished student population. But now Hahn saw that this was the adaptive program. This program could live on in parallel to mainstream education and could sort of keep this torch alight and keep this model alive and available to students until such a time as education came back to claim it. Well, we still have the claim check, and we're still waiting, and we're still hoping, but we also have made some progress. Hahn, in fact, planned and hoped for obsolescence for Outward Bound. He hoped that when education came back to claim this school of education, which has since been defined with the term experiential education, that Outward Bound could then die a gentle death and would live on in 1,000 schools around the world and around the country. I should say at this stage that I do not blame educators or education for what has happened. We're all responsible. We're all teachers. Every sector of society plays a role in education. It's been a collective failing. We've set up our educators to fail. We've given them a system that is not responsive. And we've just become so fractionated in how we approach anything as important as education that until we deal with that value system, we can't expect the technology of education to really flourish. So this is not a sort of a beat up on educators. In fact, I was with somebody who I consider an extraordinary educator the other day, Michael Grice here in Portland. He and Ollie Smith and I were having breakfast together, and Michael used a wonderful term. He said, well, we were talking about a certain school, and he said, we have a school of 500 families. And that was an incredibly important statement, because he does not think in terms of students. He thinks in terms of the collective responsibility for education, which must include the family, both nuclear and beyond. I think we all know the facts about what's going on these days. To review a couple of them, but I won't bore you. By the time a high school student graduates, they've basically gone through 29,000 hours of conditioning to sit immobile. I mean, the adolescent is a heat machine. You feed it energy and it just explodes. And we give 29,000 hours of conditioning to sit still. Again, a peculiar approach to the issue. 17,000 hours of TV for the average student, 1,200 hours, 12,000 hours of schooling in which teachers talk 85% of the time, and 2,000 hours on yellow buses. And that's linked with some other influences that are working against us. Robert Bly's book on Iron John, which has become popular recently, talks about the total failure in male mentoring of the relationship between elder men and younger men. Certainly two-income families have become a problem. It's become significantly more difficult for parents to spend the type of nurturing time with their children. We have not responded to make up for these shortcomings. The children of today are never alone, and they're always alone. They never spend a moment with themselves. And that time for introspection is where growth is most nurtured. But they are always alone in that they can never be vulnerable to their peers. And this is truly the source of the misery of unimportance. The results of that: gangs, drugs, teenage pregnancy, dropouts, apathy, etc. Paul Obersucker, who is a longtime supporter of Outward Bound and a crusader to try and bring Outward Bound back into the mainstream of education, and was the dean of the School of Education at Harvard, likened what's happening now to an atomic pile. The atoms are split from this extraordinary human atomic pile that we now have. We have a culture where people have so much access to stimulants, to depressants, to tranquilizers, to any number of influences which were never available before, that we have this human atomic pile. And atoms are splitting, and there is huge power being released. And it takes this negative manifestation, because there are no graphite rods that seem to work, that have been lowered into this pile to bring up a constructive manifestation of this power. And that, I hope, is what we try to do in our own small way in Outward Bound. Another slide. Education has produced a vast population able to read, but unable to distinguish what is worth reading. George Macaulay Trevelyan, 1962. So what do we do at Outward Bound, and how do we do it? We help people, especially young people, in this vast supermarket of contradictory messages and influences that is our country in the United States, to find their own ethic. We don't define what that ethic is. We teach them how to mount the search for it, how to mount the expedition for their ethic, how to recognize it when they find it, and how to have the knowledge of self and the strength of character to defend it when it's not the shared ethic with the majority of others, which if it's a true ethic, it won't be. How do we do this? Well, there's an Outward Bound adage that says that if you're a good Outward Bound instructor, you can do an Outward Bound course under a picnic table. I don't fit under most picnic tables, so I haven't tried it. But our courses last from a one-day refresher course to courses that last 90 days, a semester course. The younger the student, usually the longer the course, the more effective it is. Because the source of learning really is to find each person's disability, to have them find it for themselves, and to learn to coexist with that, and to make that disability into an opportunity. And we all have those disabilities. We just don't know where they are. Most of the courses we do here in the Northwest, and our school is based here in Portland, but serves students from around the country, but primarily from the West Coast, in the states of Oregon, Washington, and California, and soon Mexico. Most of our courses are about 22 days, the most effective ones. And they go something like this. The students arrive, they get off an airplane, they're picked up by a bus, and they go out into the wilderness. They get off the bus, and it's a total catharsis. They're out of everything that they're used to. Their comfort level has been stripped away. This exoskeleton of pretense that was the problem that so many people had down in the Antarctic that builds up more and more was immediately stripped away. It didn't work. It didn't function. So that's taken away, and you get this sort of human equivalent to a lobster that's just shed its armor and feels totally vulnerable. The people are then given some basic skills in how to exist in the wilderness and some safety rules, and then off they go. From that point on, a good Outward Bound course is like a fugue. It's a repetition of the same theme, more complex each time, more challenging each time. Sometimes the challenge is physical. It's going up a 200-foot rock face. Sometimes it's psychological. It's staying up a little longer. It's focusing on a thought a little longer. And each time, it's giving this group of students the information to surmount an obstacle, whether it's physical or psychological, but not the method, just the information, and then saying, there's the obstacle, go for it. And then watching this dynamic, watching people's strengths and weaknesses come out to solve that problem. And it's fascinating to watch. And it removes, what it creates is a form of leadership, which is leadership minus machismo. The machismo is completely withdrawn because people realize that to solve this problem, most of leadership is followership. That it's each person putting their little piece, their little share of the alchemy of success into the pot to make it work. As the course goes on, the instructors remove themselves less and less. Their skills grow until at the end, a finals expedition is mounted, which can be a summit attempt of a mountain. It can be a particularly challenging rapid on a river. It can be a rock face in a desert. It can be a tremendously difficult course to sail at sea on a sailboat across currents. And the students do it all by themselves. Nobody's there to help them. Now, there are the guardian angels. The instructors are out there waiting just in case anything does go wrong, and we have a wonderful safety record. But they're unapparent to the students. They're invisible to the students. They're just shadows. And then the students do this, and they come into the end of their course. And to go to a course ending of an Outward Bound course is absolutely remarkable, because in science, the type of things I dealt with mostly in science, my great-grandchildren won't really know if I've done good. But in an Outward Bound course, you just look at the faces of students and you know that you've succeeded. It's most instant. My job has the most instant gratification of any job I know. These students come off the course. Their mouths are going 90 miles an hour. They can do anything. They can achieve anything. They haven't only got their first handhold of self-respect, they're most of the way up the rock face. But then what happens? They get back on that bus, they go back to the airport and fly back to Tucson or Portland and so on, and they go back to the world. Their mouths are still going 90 miles an hour, and they arrive, and their parents are delighted that it was a good investment for the first couple of days. And then they say, when is this going to stop? And the reason is they're not literate. They don't understand what happened. And one of our challenges in Outward Bound is to include the family more. The other challenge that we have is that Outward Bound, primarily until now, has operated in the wilderness. And there are only a certain group in society who is economically or psychologically prepared to go into the wilderness, i.e. to pay the tuition or to just be prepared to enter this alien environment. If we take some inner city kids and we send them into the wilderness, along with some kids who've been hiking with their parents since they were 10 years old, you're going to compound the archetype prejudices. We can't afford to do that. So what Outward Bound has done, and what we have only just begun and we're learning, is we're setting outposts in cities to try and work with kids in their normal environments and build them up to the threshold so that they arrive at the starting line at the same time and at the same place as the rest of the population. We're operating in a lot of places. Perhaps one of our most successful programs in cities is in New York. And this is some quotes from John Gatto, who was the New York Teacher of the Year in 1990. Some more slides. The children I teach are indifferent to the adult world. This defies the experience of thousands of years. A close study of what big people were up to was always the most exciting occupation of youth. But nobody wants to grow up these days, and who can blame them? Toys are us. The children I teach have a poor sense of the future, of how tomorrow is inextricably linked to today. They live in a continuous present. The exact moment that they are in is the boundary of their consciousness. The children I teach are uneasy with intimacy or candor. They cannot deal with genuine intimacy because of a lifelong habit of preserving a secret self inside an outer personality made up of artificial bits and pieces of behavior borrowed from television or acquired to manipulate teachers, because they are not what they represent themselves to be. The disguise wears thin in the presence of intimacy, so intimate relationships are to be avoided. This is, again, exactly what I saw in the Antarctic. I feel that in Outward Bound we do have a large part of the answer. 20 years from now, I hope that Outward Bound will still be delivering superb courses in the wilderness, and we should be, because the wilderness is a uniquely American asset and a part of our culture that should be utilized to the greatest degree. It's an amazing educational asset. Because one of the best ways to teach values, and this is a small aside, another reason I came to Outward Bound, one of the best ways in which a community manifests its values is its treatment of the environment. If you go down a street where there are flowers and where the lawns are mowed and so on, chances are there's a pretty good value system thriving. If everything's trashed, the chances are that it isn't. And if you can build this appreciation for environment, that ends up incorporating people. That's the triangular ethic. Who do I include in my world? At the top of the pyramid are just those who include themselves. At the bottom of those who include others, rocks, trees, plants, etc. And it's not up to us to dictate where in that triangle, but to show people what the triangle is and how to find their place in it. Here in Portland, in Oregon, we ran a very successful program a number of years ago, actually quite recently, 2 years ago, called the WAY program, which was for adjudicated youth. It had tremendous success in almost every parameter. To read some of them, and these were this was a result of academic research, and each parameter has a different unit rate, but all I can tell you, and I'd be glad to show this research for anybody who would like to see it, is that the curves were just extraordinarily steep and had not been seen in many other circumstances by the researchers themselves. And those parameters were self-confidence and esteem, locus of control. Locus of control is a term that's given to what do I take responsibility for myself, and what do I refuse accountability for and blame on the fact that I've come from a deprived background or that it didn't happen on my watch, essentially. Interpersonal confidence, physical fitness, and this is a little aside again, which fascinates me, except for the 50-yard dash. That was the only thing that actually didn't get better, and maybe people were running away from less, I don't know. Academic achievement in the case of adjudicated youth recidivism. All around the country at programs that we have in urban centers of Atlanta, Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, San Diego, San Francisco, and St. Louis, we're slowly finding our way back into education. It's happening more effectively in the independent school system because they have perhaps more freedom of movement, and certainly in some cases more funding, or more funding that they can apply to the problems. And it's estimated that 300,000 people have been through Outward Bound courses, but almost 3 million people have been through Outward Bound lookalike courses. So directly or indirectly, we've almost touched 3.5 million people in 28 years in the United States. In the future, Outward Bound, owned by schools, Outward Bound goes to schools and gives them what we have. If we do it well, then more people will want to come out and join us in the wilderness, and more people will be able to do that. But we must give experiential education back to the school systems. I see great hope of that. The final slide is a quote from one of our students. Anytime you remove an uninterested, complacent, spoiled child like me out of a comfortable world of pizza and movies and heated houses and hot tubs, you are bound to do two things. One, make the child, i.e. me, uncomfortable, and two, teach him or her a very valuable lesson in life. I have learned the challenging and changing roles of a leader, to facilitate a consensus on group goals, to organize the group, making sure its reasoning is its full reasoning and resources are employed to the advantage of the group, to achieve those goals, to push the group onward in achieving any goal that it sets its mind to. And this was a young man called David Dorn, who was sponsored by Safeco Corporation in Lake Oswego to go on this course. At the beginning of this speech, it was said that I had one of the best jobs in the world, and I thoroughly agree. So I'd be glad to answer some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. I think until today I thought that perhaps one of the best allegories for life was baseball. It may still be, but the Outward Bound experience certainly teaches us that the unexamined life is sterile indeed, and we thank you for your thoughts and your concepts as well. They're very exhilarating. Our first question today will be asked by Gretchen Lashley, member of the Board of Directors.
My thanks too. I'm wondering, should a large city school district decide to integrate Outward Bound and to mainstream it more or less, a large district like maybe Portland with 55,000 students or what have you, what would one of the first things that they would want to do be, or one or two of the things they would need to do in order to have that happen?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to engage the students, and you have to do it in a positive way. You've got to offer the students an opportunity to develop leadership, and that's, I think, how you've got to promote it to the student body. And you've got to give the student body responsibility to get it going. It can happen in a number of ways. We have some wonderful activities that take no technology. They don't take rivers or mountains to make them happen. And we're doing that in a lot of alternative schools presently in San Francisco. And then that becomes a catalyst. Start with a catalyst of a small number of students, then have it grow. Make it voluntary. Make it a catalyst of interest. And I think the other thing is that the teachers must be involved, and we're putting a large emphasis in working with teachers, training the trainers. Because if you have students who are engaged, literate, and excited about this, but you have a teacher body who don't speak the language, you have some problems. So I think my first thing would be to put a group of teachers through an Outward Bound experience themselves and establish the literacy in the faculty. Then you've got the champions who can really make it work on site. And also they have to own it. It has to be intramural, not extramural.
Dennis Cusack, City Club member. In listening to you talk, I have this wonderful picture of, that I'm not sure is true or not, but let me, I guess, explain it to you and see if it is, of an inner city youth from, I suppose, Los Angeles or Houston or Portland or somewhere, from possibly a disadvantaged background, maybe a troubled background, going through this experience and learning something about themselves and breaking that pattern in the environment in which they exist, that would be immensely valuable. But the program also, as I hear you talk about it, sounds expensive. And I wonder a couple things. I guess one, in the 300,000 or so, whatever number, that have gone through these kinds of programs, what is that cross-section? How many people are those that I described? And also, how is it funded? How does someone like that get involved in a program like this? You mentioned someone being sponsored by Safeco. Are those kids that I'm describing, are they getting these opportunities, or is it for a totally different sort of class of people, that, or the type of people with types of backgrounds that may not benefit as much?
That's what I call a question. A few parameters, and these parameters are a little, require a couple of qualifications. 25% of our students are scholarshiped to some degree. The average scholarship is about 50% of the course of the cost of the course. And these are what we call our open enrollment or public tuition paying courses. Another large section of our student population are kids from the inner cities who we do courses specifically designed for them. As an example, our program in Los Angeles starts off with a day on a ropes course, on a challenge course, an obstacle course in the Santa Monica Hills. Then they go out to the Joshua Tree Monument area down in Southern California for 3 to 5 days of a wilderness program, and then they come back for another program, which hopefully school counselors, parents, and so on also become involved with. So about half of our students, when you compile those two numbers, when you put those two numbers together, about half our student population is nationally, and about, a little more than a third in our school are receiving substantial or complete financial support for their course. Now, in terms of our open enrollment courses, our public tuition paying courses, that comes from corporate sponsorship, generosity of our own board, who's extremely generous, and from just an outreach effort into the community. In our urban program courses and our education, our inner city courses, they are mostly funded by foundations and by corporations again. We have The only places where we have managed to engage government funding, and it's usually local government funding, are in New York and Baltimore, to a lesser extent in Boston. We have not managed to do that in the West Coast, primarily due to the crisis in the education economy. I think that we do the very best job that we can in bringing our product to the largest population possible. Pragmatically, it's the tuition-paying student who supports our school. So basically, every piece of income that we have available for allocation goes to that pool. And I would say that the number of students who had a 100% support from us, especially in the urban programs, within the last year was probably in the region of about 600 students. So, and I hope that we can improve on that. But the way to really improve on it is by working with the schools, by making it intramural. If we're a budget add-on, we will never survive. And what we can then focus, if the schools do pick it up on, is providing a much larger scholarship commitment to the wilderness courses, which I think the students who get the most out of this program will then still have a very strong desire to participate in. I hope that answers most of your questions. Yes.
I'm Marcia Slappy, member of the club. I'll tell you something personally first. My sister has a granddaughter who is in Outward Bound this summer, and the money came from every corner of their house practically, but it's worth it because they've had that poor child in several circumstances, and they hope and pray for the best for Outward Bound. Now, if she comes back and has some self-esteem, is there some way in school that this will be kept up, or don't the children usually go back to regular education?
Oh, very much they go back to regular education. We are very limited into how much follow-up that we can provide. That's why partnerships are so important to us. We have to work with organizations active, especially in the inner cities, who can then keep this spirit alive and who we can continue to collaborate with. And the great opportunity here, which is, I think, an unfulfilled opportunity in its fullest sense, is in service. If the kids have got the educational product that we have really tried to give them, they should come back with a thirst for service. And that giving is what keeps it alive.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Mary McCarthy, member. You spoke about the outcome of your work with children that were having troubles, and I wonder how you measure the impact of the success, and also how long of a time period have you followed these kids, for how many years, to see whether the effects of the program are long-lasting?
That's an extremely good question, and it's also the reason for one of the policy shifts that we're making in Outward Bound nationally. Some of our programs, such as the one in Baltimore and New York, we've managed to come up with data sets over a number of years, which give very quantifiable results in terms of dropout rates, in terms of recidivism, locus of control, the other things that I mentioned. In programs where we worked with community-based organizations and social service organizations aimed at solving some specific social ill, we've had a real problem tracking that population, because very often they don't stay with the agency who they came to us from. So what we have decided to do very consciously is to work with the education community as the partner, because that's where kids stay. That's where the effect can be sustained, and that's where we can get the type of academic oversight that we need. We have a partner now in the Stanford School of Education. The dean of that school is on our board here on the West Coast, and we now have one of their professors and a team of graduate students basically doing a multi-year research project on the programs that we're doing in Los Angeles and San Francisco. But the thing is that it's one of those pragmatic things. We work best with those students who are motivated and want to be with us. You can spend a tremendous amount of energy and money in working with those kids who don't want to be there and who really are disinterested, and the success rates are far inferior. Motivation is a real primary prerequisite. And that's why we feel that education and kids who are perhaps at risk in some instances, although, again, that's the minority of our students, and also I think one of the reasons why I didn't stress disadvantaged in any particular sense is that I think disadvantage is generic. There are different types. I think almost every child in this country is disadvantaged. But in terms of those who are chronically disadvantaged and who are in trouble, I think that the partners with those kids have to be people who can stay with them much longer. And there are other people who can do that. We have to work with the education community, and we have to work with those who do keep the kids with them longer, but not in, an adjudicated program, as an example. We, Outward Bound, I think, took on too many causes for a period of its history, and we're now trying to nationally focus that, and that's a movement I very much support. I hope that answers your question. I can share the results of this research with you, too.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Hart, I'm, I guess, a survivor of World War II, and I was 18, 20, 21 at that time. And I keep looking back at that experience, and I'm wondering about the draft. The draft for military service or for public service, maybe Peace Corps, some choices. Is this something that is missing and perhaps should come back in that form with some choices?
Well, I think that a very notable American educational philosopher said that a good school should provide the moral equivalent to war. It should provide visceral challenge. It should require courage and tenacity, but without the deprivation and the violence of war. We have sought to do that. Principal partners that we have are the Youth Corps and the Conservation Corps. And again, in Outward Bound, I think that there was a period way back where Outward Bound thought it was a train, and I think now we have a very clear realization that we're a boxcar. We have to know who's ahead of us and who's behind us and where those linkages are. And the long-term service component is an extremely important one. So Conservation Corps, student body programs in schools and so on, absolutely are the way that this Peace Corps type of activities are the way to go. And we hope and pray that we'll see greater government funding for those types of activities, because that definitely is a solution.
Mark Hammer, City Club member. If I read you right, your emphasis in this Outward Bound process is really on process as opposed to content. I'd be interested, if that is true, in how that influences your faculty development and what you do by way of developing faculty. And do they have, for example, training in interpersonal process skills or the whole dynamics as opposed to content areas?
Okay, primary qualifications for Outward Bound faculty are two things. One is a demonstrated level of technical skill, which we need for safety, rock climbing, river rafting, sailing, whatever. But linked with that, and which is the much more difficult quality to find, is a very strong interpersonal skill expertise. The only way that we can guarantee that happening is that each one of our staff members has an individual development plan. Each course is debriefed at the end to find out what went wrong and what went right. And the other thing is that a huge amount of time and money is spent annually on training. We don't even assume, because many of our staff are with us for 3 to 9 months a year, not with us the full year, they're contract personnel, who many of them come back year after year, but each year we put an enormous amount of effort into training and interpersonal training. This year at our Oregon base camp out near Bend, we had a 2.5-day session, which was absolutely wonderful to hear, on the ethics of environmental education, the student rights. When you've got a student halfway up a rock face who says, I don't want to be here, let me down. You know, what's your ethical responsibility there as a teacher? Do you say, no, you've got to learn, you've got to go up, or do you let them down? So we put a tremendous amount of effort. We make no assumptions there. And oversight there is extremely immediate and constant. Outward Bound also attracts some extraordinary people. I mean, our staff work for very, very little. I mean, they work in the world's most glorious classroom, but they are certainly not there for the financial reward, and they're there because there is not one person who works for our school who does not have a chronically overdeveloped sense of compassion. And that is where everything flows from. And that is the principal product that we're trying to give to our students, is compassion. If they leave our course with a sense of compassion and a desire for service, we've done our job. And I'm delighted to report that in almost all cases, that is the case. And usually it's not when a parent has bribed their child with a Mustang to do the course or something.
Here's a written question from one of the members in the audience. It's asked in light of the 1986 tragedy on Mount Hood, when a private school's outdoor education outing ended in the deaths of several students. Experiential education necessarily carries more physical risk than sitting in a classroom, this person asks. How do you deal with this issue of risk regarding the nurturer's requirement that students not be subjected to possible injury?
Essentially, we have a national safety program where every one of our schools is audited annually internally and by our national body externally once every 2 years. So annually internally and once every 2 years externally. And they go through the schools with a tooth comb, looking for everything from bald tires to instructors' attitudes with students. It's been 13 years since we've had a fatality at Outward Bound related to a course activity. And that's an extraordinary track record. It's something that takes absolute diligence and also a slightly prophylactic view of risk, in that you can't, the risk that the student perceives that they're at cannot be fully real. If you're 200 feet up a rock face, as far as you're concerned, you step out, you die. But that's not the case. If you step out, you've got 3 people on a rope and 2 ropes attached to you, which absolutely guarantees that nothing will happen to you. There are always risks in everything. But there is much more risk in crossing a road than taking an Outward Bound course or in participating in the experiential education activities that most independent and public schools mount. That's purely a management function. You've got to make it appear that the risk is real and visceral, but in fact you've got to have 3 or 4 backups. And it can be done. I mean, it's like running an airline. It's attention to detail.
Mary McWilliams, City Club member. I'm curious about whether Outward Bound varies from country to country, or what you can tell us about students in the United States compared to their peers in other countries.
Oh, that's another half-hour talk. There are 38 Outward Bound schools, and I think it's now 27 countries. I just came back from Outward Bound's 50th anniversary conference in the UK. Schools just opened in Czechoslovakia, which has actually been running underground for 3 years. They took students out into the mountains and ran first-class, high-quality courses, dodging from the police. In South Africa, under apartheid, they were running integrated programs, and the Outward Bound school is at the top of this narrow valley, and they had lookouts the whole time, and the white inspectors would come in new cars, and the African inspectors would come in old cars. So they would see the type of car, and they'd say, there's a white inspector coming, they'd hide all the black students, and vice versa. This went on for 10 years. Everybody knew it was happening, but they couldn't get caught, and they operated sort of, again, underground. The largest Outward Bound school in the world is in Nigeria, 15,000 students a year. Every government employee in Nigeria has to do an Outward Bound course. And it was also one of the catalysts that began to end the Biafran War, was the formation of the Outward Bound School. Outward Bound School in Hong Kong, which is helping the youth there cope with the uncertainties of the future. In Kenya, every government manager has to go through an Outward Bound course. In France, Outward Bound is working with the French Red Cross in establishing a volunteer corps, which is a ready reserve force for emergencies. They have a law in France which says that if you are a member of an emergency team, it's like a sort of a National Guard arrangement, that you can go off and do disaster relief. So we've been working with those young people who then go off and do inoculations in Peru. And I think that in the United States, Outward Bound started as the training mechanism. Its first foothold in the United States was as a training element for the Peace Corps. And I'm never one not to think in a grandiose manner, and I think that Outward Bound has lost some of its grandiosity, of its ambition in this country. And I think we do have to look at how we can really be of national service, because we have the ability to do that. It's being done elsewhere. And those are just a few vignettes.
In learning about Outward Bound today, we've not only educated but inspired, and as we adjourn, let us thank our speaker today, Paul Dudley Hart.